Over the past couple of seasons, Frank Clark has been a consistent yet underrated pass rusher for the Seahawks. Lining up behind Cliff Avril and Michael Bennett, not many people really talked about him as one of the premier edge rushers in the NFL. Over the last 2 years, though, he's collected 19 sacks combined. This season, both Avril and Bennett are gone, and Clark is already off to a good start. He's collected 5.5 sacks in his first 6 games, and he's easily on pace to break double digits. Before we begin looking at his tape, though, I wanted to see how these numbers compare to some of the top rushers around the league. I will note that the 5 I chose in this comparison are all in their final contract year. In Khalil Mack's case, I grabbed his data prior to him getting traded to the Bears. I wanted to use his stats that led to his new contract as a baseline for this discussion. As we can see, DeMarcus Lawrence and Ezekiel Ansah have produced the highest sack rate per game. However, we all know that sacks aren't everything. Pressures, forced fumbles, tackles for loss are all very important metrics as well. This is why Mack was paid so much this offseason. Now, if we look at Clark in particular, he's averaging a pressure on roughly every 8th pass rush. This is better than guys like Jadeveon Clowney and Ezekiel Ansah, but it's obviously not as good as Mack or Lawrence. Regardless, it's still impressive, and it's going to play a big role this offseason when his contract is up. With that out of the way, let's jump to his film. When I turn on Clark's tape, I see a player that can generate pressure on his own. I see a pass rusher who uses a combination of speed and power in order to get into the backfield. He's not a one-trick pony by any means. Versus the Raiders, Clark uses his favorite chop rip move in order to beat the left tackle. After lining up in a Y9 alignment, he bursts up the field. He uses inside hand to chop down the left tackle's outstretched arm. After clearing Miller's initial punch, Clark bent low and then ripped underneath in order to disengage from a second attempt. This is what got Clark in the backfield and allowed him to strip the quarterback. He did the same thing a couple weeks earlier against Tyron Smith and the Cowboys. He chopped at his outstretched hand and then ripped underneath him to get to the quarterback. While he didn't get the sack on this one, he forced Prescott to step up in the pocket. This allowed another defender to take him down for the sack. Outside of using this move, Clark does a great job of converting speed to power. It's extremely impressive how he can instantly collapse the pocket. Watch this play versus the Cardinals. After the snap, Clark took 2 steps up the field and then angled his rush towards the blocker. He put his hands out in front of him and then arched his back to get his full force behind him. The left tackle didn't have a chance. He was instantly torpedoed back 3 yards, and Clark was ready to disengage to collect the sack, but Rosen got the ball quickly. In the same game, Clark almost had another sack, but Rosen did the same thing. He threw the ball deep to his receiver when only a moment later and Clark would have gotten the sack. After the snap, Clark used a one-arm stab move where he uses length as a weapon. Since his right arm is longer than the offensive tackle's reach, he used that to his advantage. After rounding the corner, Clark then put his left hand on the right tackle's right arm and disengaged from the block. After throwing the blocker out of the way, he then cleared him with his left hand and got to Rosen right after he threw the pass. In his most recent game against the Raiders, Clark collected 2.5 sacks. He was everywhere, and there was one play that showed exactly just how strong Clark is. And yes, if you're a Seahawks fan, you know what play's coming next. This came at the start of the third quarter. Clark used a full press lockout and nailed Miller to the ground. His incredible strength bulldozed the left tackle out of the way. Now, some of the media have suggested that Miller tripped on this play, but if you look at his feet closely, this was all Clark that created the sack. While Clark clearly has upside with his speed and power, he isn't the best at piecing moves together. After his first rush fails, he resorts to effort and motor as opposed to having a second move ready. This caused him to stall if a blocker is prepared for his initial move. Again, I do like his effort, but he rarely has a second move ready. After he gains initial penetration with his strong bull rush, I want to see him finish a blocker. I want to see him use a bull jerk or another counter move after his first rush fails. For example, this one-arm stab and grab versus the Cardinals was amazing. He perfectly bull rushed the right guard in the pocket, and then he finished his rush with a spin move. This was awesome, but Clark rarely does it. I can count the number of times he had a second move ready on one hand. Moving on, something that stood out to me so far this season was that Clark was not always allowed to use his strength as a pass rusher. According to my tracking, he was only allowed to rush one-on-one with an offensive tackle 51% of his snaps. 14% of his snaps he dealt with double teams, and the other 35% were split between stunts and contained duties. These extra roles really impacted his ability to get to the quarterback. The Seahawks purposely used him as a decoy just to open up other defenders in the defensive line. So, the question you have to ask is, why do the Seahawks do this? If Clark is as good as I say he is, then why don't they fully unleash him in their defense? The answer to this question is rather simple. Clark shares a defensive line with guys like Shamar Stephen, Jaron Reed, and Quentin Jefferson. If the Seahawks allowed him to rush more on his own, the rest of the guys would be less effective. In layman's terms, they purposely handicap his pass rush just to maximize the strength of the other members on this defense. This, in my opinion, is the main reason why the Seahawks have to find help from on the defensive line. I don't think the Seahawks will ever stop using him in this role completely, but having somebody opposite of him could allow Seattle to rush him more traditionally. Another thing that I haven't mentioned yet is that Clark typically doesn't play on first downs. While this may seem like an indictment to his run defense ability, since first downs have a higher probability of a running play, I see it differently. I see it as a team that desperately needs him to focus on rushing the passer because they simply don't have anybody else on this team to do this. Generally speaking, and to wrap up this video, Clark has already earned himself a big paycheck this offseason. Khalil Mack signed a mega $23 million deal with the Bears, and while I don't see Clark getting that much, he should break $20 million. The franchise tag was a little bit over 17 this offseason, so if the Seahawks really want to keep him, they're gonna have to pony up. In my opinion, not only should Pete Carroll and John Snyder lock him up long term, they need to go after one of the other pass rushers I talked about. Having a guy like DeMarcus Lawrence or my personal favorite Jadeveon Clowney, it would be an instant upgrade to this defense. If the Seahawks want to compete for a Super Bowl next year, this is what I would do going forward. It's time to pay Frank Clark and build the defensive line around him. Well, that's all I have for you in this one. For the rest of the season, MyBookie is my official sponsor. If you want a 100% sign-up bonus for up to $1,000, you can use the promotion code SAM100. I'll continue doing breakdowns like this one all season long, and on Saturday mornings, I'll also be giving betting advice as well. You are more than welcome to join in or bet against me, or bet on one of the many other sports and games they offer. Thank you so much for all of your support for watching my videos. If you want to keep this channel going, you can support me on my Patreon account, or you can find me on Twitter at Samuel R. Gold.